Hello, everyone. My name is Melinda Hall, and I am Associate Professor and Chair of Philosophy at Stetson University in DeLand, Florida. I'm coming to you from my office space. I am a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair. I'm wearing headphones because my microphone is broken, and a black turtleneck. And I'm very glad to be moderating today's session. Please note that the CC button below, as many of you will have already seen, those of you who've been engaging at this conference, you can use that CC button to generate captions for the session. Also, please engage with Q&A after Dr. Garson's talk with the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So I'm very glad to introduce to you Justin Garson. Justin is Professor of Philosophy at Hunter College and the Graduate Center, City University of New York, and a contributor for PsychologyToday.com and Aeon. He has two new books, Madness, A Philosophical Exploration with Oxford University Press this year, and a second edition of his text, The Biological Mind, A Philosophical Introduction with Routledge. In addition to previous monographs, including What Biological Functions Are and Why They Matter with Cambridge in 2019, he has written dozens of papers on topics such as aging, madness, genetics, mental representation, biological functions, mechanisms in science, and the concept of information in neuroscience. So I look forward to your talk, Justin, and I will be here monitoring the chat for questions.
Okay, thank you so much, Melinda, and thank you for being here. I want to thank Shelley for inviting me. Let me get this set up, make sure. Okay. So I'm sitting in my office. I'm a white man with a gray colored shirt and a beard and some artwork behind my head. So the question I want to pursue today is, where does psychiatry's authority come from? And here's what I'll do. I'll begin just by giving some preliminary clarification. What do I mean by asking where psychiatry's authority comes from? And then I'll give my answer to that question, namely that medicine has authority to treat certain distressing or disturbing mental phenomena to the extent that it sees those phenomena as stemming from a certain kind of inner cause, namely what I call one that violates a norm of nature. And I want to be clear from the outset that this isn't my proposal for where medicine's authority ought to come from. It's an attempt to explicate what I see as an ontological commitment implicit within medicine itself. And then I'm going to give historical evidence that this actually is where medicine's authority comes from. And then I'll wrap up by noting some consequences for future discussion. And one of the motives for this work is the following. Sometimes we have a distressing or disturbing mental phenomenon like depression or anxiety or voices or BPD traits. And we say that this is or this does or that it doesn't fall under the jurisdiction of medicine. And I'm wondering how that choice transforms the way that we experience and understand this phenomenon. And I take it that that's a precursor for thinking carefully about the risks and benefits of deeming something to be a medical problem. You want to know how calling something a medical problem changes the way that we experience and understand it. And I'll start by telling you a little bit about how I took up an interest in this question. Not long ago, I was reading a book called What is Mental Disorder by Derek Bolton. And early on, he says that the purpose of the book is to show that there's no objective criterion for distinguishing disorder from non-disorder, that it depends on our values. And then he said something that really stood out to me. He almost hastens to add, look, I'm not questioning medicine's authority to treat mental illness, almost as if to say, dear reader, When I tell you that there's no objective way to distinguish disorder from non-disorder, you might think that I'm trying to challenge psychiatry's authority, but I assure you, I am in no way challenging psychiatry's authority. So somehow for him, this question of demarcation is connected to this question of the authority of psychiatry, and he wants us to know that he's not questioning the latter. And around the same time, I got this other thing on my email, and it was a call for abstracts for the 2023 meeting of the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry. And I hope I see some of you there. And the special topic of next year's meeting is expertise and authority. So I thought, well, this is great, because maybe this will be a conference where I find out why psychiatry has authority over certain distressing or disturbing phenomena. But then twice in the call for abstracts, it says, or it suggests perhaps that psychiatry does have legitimate authority in treating mental illness, and that one role of the conference is really to better clarify the extent of that authority. Now, I might have just been tired when I read it, or I still had Bolton's book in my head, but I read that as saying, look, nobody's questioning that psychiatry has authority to treat mental health problems. We're dealing with some peripheral questions about how that authority interfaces with other kinds of authority, like lived experience and so on. So I thought, well, this is interesting. There's this thing called the authority of psychiatry, and there seems to be almost a certain pressure among philosophers to assure everybody that they're not questioning it. And so that led to the question of this talk. Well, what is this thing called psychiatry's authority, and where does it come from? Now, I've talked to people who have said, look, Justin, you're making a big deal out of nothing. Nobody's trying to hide anything. Nobody's trying to conceal anything or silence anybody. That's because the basis of psychiatry's authority is just so obvious. And this is certainly what Derek Bolton seems to think, that it's so obvious where it comes from that if you question it, it would just reveal a profound level of ignorance. And here's what he says. Medicine has authority over human suffering. That's a truism. Mental disorders can cause profound suffering, sometimes for the person who has it, sometimes for other people around them. Therefore, medicine has authority over them. And other people have said the same thing. Awais Aftab, in a blog he wrote just last week, responding to something that I said, he says, medicine has authority over suffering. Mental disorders can create profound suffering. Medicine has authority over them. Now, as a philosopher of psychiatry, I always thought that this idea that medicine just has authority over suffering was obviously false. And not to come down on anybody, it's just I always thought that was kind of just obviously wrong, because there are a lot of psychological conditions that create profound suffering, either for oneself or others, but we don't consider them to be part of medicine. From my own experience, the most profound suffering I've ever gone through is the pain of unrequited love. It's just agonizing, but it's even worse when not just you love somebody and they don't love you back, but then when they go and date your best friend, that's just, it's just hellish in a way I would never wish on anybody. But here's the interesting thing. When I was undergoing, thank you, when I was undergoing that agony, nobody ever said, I think you need to see a doctor. And in general, I think we would be offended by the suggestion that the pain of unrequited love is a medical problem. I mean, if somebody tried to put that in a DSM-6, I think all hell would break loose. I'm not saying it can't become a medical problem if it spirals out of control, nor am I denying that unrequited love can be addressed by certain mental health professionals. If somebody said, Justin, here's a therapist that has helped me a lot, maybe they can help you work through the grief that you're feeling. Okay, maybe. But it seems like the fact that something is distressing or disturbing, that alone doesn't make it a medical problem. So, okay, so what is the authority of psychiatry based on if it's not simply based on the manifest suffering of individuals who experience mental illness or their community? And I think it's kind of hard to answer this question, partly just because it seems obvious to most of us, at least in wealthy, industrialized countries, that various distressing or disturbing mental phenomena are medical problems. Anti-psychiatrists aside, I think psychiatry has been very successful convincing everybody over the last 50 years, again, in wealthy, industrialized countries, that doctors do have authority over mental illness. But what I also know from researching the history of madness is that that wasn't always the case. It wasn't always obvious to people that distressing or disturbing mental phenomena fell under the jurisdiction of medicine. So I decided that in order to answer this question about where psychiatry's authority comes from, I would go back and look at some of these historical episodes where there was serious debate about whether or not doctors had authority over distressing mental phenomena. I would look at those cases where doctors felt called upon to justify their authority to a skeptical audience, and I'd see how they did that. So here's methodology. Go back through the history of medicine, look at cases where it wasn't obvious to people that a certain mental phenomenon fell under medicine's jurisdiction, and look at how doctors sought to justify their authority to a skeptical but educated audience. And I looked at 3 such episodes. And in each of those cases, what I found is the following. Medicine has authority over distress, not because of the character of the distress, but the nature of its cause. To say that medicine has authority over, say, depression is to make a hypothesis, is not just to say depression is awful and it causes a lot of suffering, but it's also to make a hypothesis about what causes depression. It's to say that depression proceeds from a certain kind of inner cause, namely one that violates a norm of nature. And at least the vague idea behind a norm of nature is something like this. There are certain ways the body and mind are supposed to work, and these ways things are supposed to work, these norms, aren't dictated by society, but by nature itself. In other words, it's like nature itself declares that there are certain ways that the body and mind are supposed to work, but sometimes things don't work the way that they're supposed to. And when that happens, that can have some pretty distressing and disturbing consequences. And those are the kinds of things that medicine has authority over. And this claim in various forms is what medicine appeals to again and again when it's asked to justify its authority over certain condition, when that authority is not taken for granted. So I just want to go through 3 episodes in the history of medicine where this kind of debate happened, and then I'll show you how I came to this conclusion. Okay, so first we'll go back to about 400 BC to ancient Greece and consider clashes between the Hippocratic doctors and the faith healers. Both groups had certain beliefs about how to treat madness. So there were certain phenomena that they agreed fell under the banner of madness, like a paradigm would be somebody running around screaming for no apparent reason. They agreed that this counts as madness, but they disagreed about whose job it was to manage. The faith healers saw madness as a punishment from the gods, and so they thought that it fell within the jurisdiction of the priests, not the doctors. They had careful methods for looking at the form of madness and deciding which god was responsible and which god you had to make amends to. So it was a very well worked out kind of method. And if you've read On the Sacred Disease, you know that the Hippocratic doctors sought to establish their authority by presenting madness as having a pathological inner cause. In this case, it was the airways getting blocked up by phlegm. And I think this episode shows two things about the Hippocratics. One, in their view, the authority of medicine over mental distress is not based exclusively on the character of the distress, but the nature of its cause. And two, for them, mental distress becomes a medical problem when it's caused by something that represents a violation of a norm of nature, something not working the way it's supposed to. We know that the airways are supposed to help move air around freely. That's what they're for. If they're clogged up with phlegm, they can't do what they're supposed to do. Okay, so a second case is physicians versus the exorcists during the early Renaissance in Europe, so 1500s. This was actually a really complex historical debate. Contrary to the way it's often framed, the exorcists never thought they had authority over all forms of madness. They agreed some forms of madness were brain disease. They recognized physicians had authority over those. The physicians, too, recognized that the exorcists had authority over some forms of madness. And that's because most of them were Christians. Most of them believed the stories of Jesus casting demons out of people. And so they would use the scripture to try to work out like characterizations for when somebody might actually be demon possessed and when they were just had some kind of a brain disease. So it's really a question of the boundary. The debate was really a debate about the precise boundary of authority. And there were these very public cases where the two groups clashed, where the exorcist saw demon possession and the physician saw brain disease. And a paradigm would be a young woman shouting blasphemies, fainting, laughing hysterically, apparently impervious to pain. Whose job is that to deal with? And the physicians sought to establish their authority in the following way. They would depict those distressing and disturbing mental phenomena as being caused by something inside of the patient that violated the norms of nature. And a key proponent of the physicians here was Edward Jordan. He thought that these distressing phenomena were usually caused by a wandering womb, or what he called suffocation of the mother. And it's important to kind of get how this works. He thought there are three main organ systems of the body: the brain, the liver, and the heart. And when the womb wanders around, it can either press into or otherwise disrupt the functioning of one or more of these organ systems. So you had to look carefully at the outward symptoms to try to figure out which organ system was being disrupted. So like if a young woman was impervious to pain, impervious to the pain of a pinprick, that the brain is the seat of sensation, and so the womb must somehow be undermining the functioning of the brain. So again, looking carefully at this debate reveals the same two ideas we encountered earlier. The authority of medicine over mental distress is based not on the character of the distress, but the nature of its cause. Specifically, mental distress becomes a medical problem when it's seen as proceeding from something in you that violates a norm of nature. Okay, third, let's jump to the early 1970s. At the time, there were a lot of psychiatrists who felt that their authority was being threatened by two different groups. On the one hand, you had the anti-psychiatrists like Foucault and Lang and Saz. And that kind of anti-psychiatry was just woven into the general culture, I think, in a way that's hard for us to understand today. And then the second group was a growing number of psychoanalytically oriented psychiatrists and other mental health professionals who simply didn't think you needed a medical degree to treat most kinds of mental illness. So they certainly thought they had authority, the psychoanalytic psychiatrists thought they had authority over mental distress, but not because they were doctors, but because they were trained in psychoanalysis. And I'm going to focus on what was going on at the United States at the time, because I just know more about that. There is this group of psychiatrists associated with the American Psychiatric Association. They were in the very early stages of planning the DSM-3. Everybody knew that it was going to be this groundbreaking volume. And Robert Spitzer had already been put in charge of that project. And they were constantly aware of these two challenges, the anti-psychiatrists and the psychoanalysts who didn't think you needed a medical degree to treat people. And the head of the APA at the time, a guy named Walter Barton, thought that it was really important that the DSM-3 have some kind of preface where it defines what mental disorder is. And he thought defining mental disorder explicitly would help to establish both the nature and the scope of medicine's authority over mental distress. So when a philosopher like Derek Bolton says, look, this whole philosophical problem of defining mental disorder really has no bearing on the problem of defining the scope and extent of psychiatry's authority, at least from a historical point of view, that's totally mistaken. These two projects were thought of as one and the same project. Maybe, I'm not saying he's wrong. Maybe they could or should have changed since then, but at least back then, these were the same project. So Robert Spitzer, in his capacity as the head of the DSM task force, sent out a call for proposals on defining what is a mental disorder, and he and his colleague, Jean Endicott, wrote the first of these proposals in 1976, and a modified version of that proposal made it into the DSM-3, which kind of figures because he wrote it or he co-wrote it, and he was the head of the DSM-3. And I've included that passage here so you can get a sense of the problems that they thought definition of mental disorder was supposed to address. But I just want to jump to the last line. One second. In red, where they say this: because of these features, there's an implicit assumption that something is wrong with the human organism. And because of that, there's a call to the profession to develop and offer preventative and therapeutic measures. So it's not that the suffering alone constitutes a call to the profession. It's the suffering which allows you to infer the presence of something going wrong inside the organism, which is an interesting word. That's what issues a call to the medical profession to deal with it. And then on the next page of that presentation, they elaborate on this point. They tell us that they endorse what they call the medical model, which for them is the working hypothesis that there are organismic dysfunctions which are relatively distinct with regard to clinical features, etiology, and course. So again, we see the exact same two ideas that we saw in the ancient Hippocratics and in the Renaissance. A, the authority of medicine over mental distress, not based entirely on the nature of the suffering, but the nature of what causes it. And two, the idea that mental distress becomes a medical problem when its particular inner cause represents a violation of a norm of nature, something in you not working the way it should. Okay, so hopefully my brief excursion into the history of madness will have shown you that at least traditionally, medicine is seen as having the authority that it does over mental health and mental illness, to the extent that it frames that mental illness as the result of something not working the way it's supposed to inside of you. Okay, so there are three conclusions that I want to draw, or at least 3 points to kind of draw out for further consideration or further conversation. And the first is this: when I say that psychiatry gets its authority by depicting kinds of suffering as being caused by something that violates a norm of nature, I'm not imposing some philosophical doctrine onto ordinary medical discourse. I'm trying to clarify what I see as one of the ontological commitments buried inside of that very discourse. So if somebody says to me, well, Justin, what do you mean by a norm of nature? You know, that sounds pretty obscure and philosophical, just like a philosopher to come up with some nonsense like that. I'm just going to turn the question right around on them and say, well, what do you mean by a norm of nature? I didn't come up with that. You came up with that. So all I'm doing is trying to clarify what you're saying. I'm not trying to impose my own clever philosophical interpretation. Now, as a philosopher, I certainly have an opinion about what a coherent answer to that question might look like. In other words, I have some idea about what it might mean to say that something inside of you violates a norm of nature. I think you need an account of proper functions to answer that question, but I don't think anybody's going to be that interested in my answer until they believe that there's actually a deep connection. That is, that there's a legitimate problem to be solved, and there's a deep connection between this one thing that we call the authority of psychiatry over mental suffering, and another thing that we call the violation of a norm of nature. Because if you don't think there's a connection, then you're not going to have any motivation to, seriously engage in the functions literature. Excuse me. Secondly, I think this idea about where psychiatry's authority comes from reveals a deep tension between two different ideas. The idea that a certain mental health condition is a functional, coherent, or purposeful response to the problems of living or to a life crisis, and the idea that it falls under the authority of medicine. I don't think that they contradict one another. I think there's just a tension between two ideas. I think that these two ideas can't sit for that long in the same brain without kind of repelling each other. So, for example, to the extent that we can see depression as a functional, coherent, or purposeful response to a crisis, I think to that extent, we're not seeing it as a violation of a norm of nature. We're actually seeing it as a fulfillment or a continuation of a norm of nature. Similarly, to the extent that we see BPD traits as survival strategies, as coherent and meaningful responses to trauma, I think that's a way of not seeing them as a violation of a norm of nature. Same with ADHD. I think to the extent that we can see ADHD as involving ordinary, non-pathological cognitive variation, that's a way of not seeing it as stemming from something that violates a norm of nature. And I think that would put into question psychiatry's authority over it. And this actually leads me to a hypothesis. It's an empirical hypothesis. The idea is that the more society comes to see mental health problems as functional responses to the problems of life or as ordinary cognitive variation, the more people will come to question the authority of psychiatry over them. And I think I think sociologically, we are more inclined to see mental health problems as functional or purposeful or coherent responses to problems of life or as ordinary cognitive variation. So I actually think that we are entering into a kind of time which is going to be a little bit more like the 1970s or the 1500s or 400 BC, where more and more people would just question why psychiatry would have authority over certain mental health conditions. I don't know if that's good or bad. I'm not taking a stance on that. I'm saying I think that's where we're going, and that's a prediction I'm making. And then I want to note finally a potential objection, and the objection goes like this. There are clearly various conditions that fall under medicine's jurisdiction that aren't pathologies, that we do not see as violating a norm of nature. And you might think that those constitute counterexamples to my thesis. So pregnancy is often thought to fall under medicine's jurisdiction. We want doctors, or a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of folks want doctors around during pregnancy. Cosmetic surgery is taken to fall under the jurisdiction of doctors, even when it's not meant to correct a pathology, sometimes just alleviating non-pathological pain, like the pain of teething, seen as a legitimate extension of medicine's authority. And I can't argue the point at length here, and I haven't thought this through really carefully, but I think my sense is that medicine's authority to deal with things like pregnancy, cosmetic surgery, non-pathological pain is grounded somehow in their authority to treat diseases. So as I see it, the authority to treat disease is like a primary sphere of authority, and the other things that they do are only seen as legitimate extensions of that authority to the extent that they can be referred back to the activities in this primary sphere. So, with pregnancy, it's obvious that the reason we want doctors around during pregnancy, to the extent that we do, is to prevent pregnancy-related diseases. So being around during pregnancy would be a legitimate extension of the natural authority to treat diseases. And that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Justin. That was absolutely fascinating. I really appreciated the approach that you took in your presentation. And I will wait to see if anyone is adding in the Q&A. Yep, so we have something from Emily Dyson, something from Richard Savelle Smith. As always, I have my own questions that I'd like to add in, but I'll refrain from using my moderator privilege to jump the line. I see Shelley also has her hand raised, and unless Shelley, you indicate that you want to go first, I will continue with the queue. So
Please
Emily
take
Dyson.
the other questions first.
Okay, thank you. So Emily Dyson says the following. Thanks for your talk. It was very interesting. What do you make of the rise of psychiatric acknowledgement of the social determinants of mental illness? In the UK, for example, the NHS has started funding, quote, social prescribing, end quote. Is this a sign of the decline of psychiatric authority, or is psychiatry looking for another foundation for its authority?
That's a great question. I don't know entirely how to answer that. Here's my sense, and this is something that frustrates me a lot, but it shouldn't be frustrating. I think there are two very different ideas that sometimes get thrown together. One is the idea that mental disorders can have social causes like isolation, unemployment, systemic racism. I think everybody grants that mental illnesses like depression can have social causes, but I think that's perfectly consistent with seeing depression as a pathology. You can imagine the brain just slowly, all of these terrible things happening to it, and slowly it just cracks, and then it's broken, and then bad things happen. And so a lot of times when psychiatrists say things like, well, we don't endorse the medical model, we endorse a biopsychosocial model, we recognize, we're so enlightened, sorry, I don't, we recognize these social precursors to mental illness. I think, yeah, but you're still using this pathology model, because the picture is the brain just getting smashed by these social problems. It breaks and then bad things happen. So I think that there's an important difference between seeing mental disorders as social, as dysfunctional pathological responses to social precursors, and seeing them as functional, purposeful, designed responses to social precursors. And that's the idea that I think is a little more challenging to, and a little more dangerous to psychiatry. If you really thought, depression is actually, to the best of our evidence, it looks like, and I'm not saying this is a point of view, it looks like a designed response to help us to detach from certain life goals. I think that's the kind of thing that would be, in my historical estimate, more threatening to psychiatry's authority.
Thanks very much, Justin. So I'm going to continue through the queue. Richard Saville Smith asks the following. You draw on Hippocrates' idea of madness as exclusively pathological, but in the Phaedrus, Plato has Socrates set out 4 kinds of divine madness: prophetic inspiration, mystical inspiration, poetic inspiration, and love. In your argument, what happens to these? Does an exclusively pathological interpretation do justice to the word madness?
Yeah, that's a great question. It gets to these kind of textual and interpretive issues of ancient medicine. And here I think Plato's view is, I think, very different from the Hippocratic view. I think the Hippocratics were much more the brain disease model. And I think Plato was trying to offer a real counterpoint to that. But even, I don't want to simplify it all, because even in the Hippocratic tradition, and I've argued this, there were a lot of diverse voices. And weirdly enough, there are a lot of passages in the Hippocratic, in some of these Hippocratic texts, even on the sacred disease or airs, waters, places, I think, where they say, this person really needs to be brought to the temple to make amendments and restitution to the gods. Or sometimes they argue that in dreams you can sometimes see that a certain god is involved in the illness. So yeah, I don't want to overgeneralize at all. I think ancient medicine has both of these points of view floating around in it, this pathology-centered point of view, but also sometimes this more purpose-centered point of view, that the purpose of your madness is to show you that you've really pissed off one of the gods and you need to go and get that cleared up.
Thanks very much. So to continue in the queue, Shelley, it would be your turn. You've withdrawn your hand, is that correct?
There are a number of questions in the Q&A now, so why don't you take those first, Melinda? Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much, Shelley. Sophia, you're next.
So thanks for a great and really interesting talk, as always. So I wonder if you could develop a little bit what do you think is meant by this in the Spitzer and Endicott quote about mental disorder. They said that mental disorders are not quickly ameliorated by simple non-technical changes of the environment or something to that effect. But is there any elaborated view, as far as you know, about what would make an environmental change simple and non-technical? Because I was just thinking about my own case, and I actually used to be kind of opposed to neurodivergent IDs and social model of disability and stuff, at least when applied across the board, so that it implicitly would apply to me too, because I used to say that, I have a totally pathological problem because I have these terrifying psychotic experiences, and being terrified is bad. It's not just a difference. But then I got this present cushy philosophy job with good job security and good pay and overall a much more stable life situation. And then I became a million times better. And I'm still weird and mad, but I feel so much better and I am in so much less distress. And then I thought, this is like a change in my environment. It's not really simple change, because it's not a simple matter to get a cushy philosophy job with good job security and good pay, as we all know. It still seems pretty non-technical. So yeah, I guess that's a question. What does this mean? Do you even know that?
Yeah, that's such a great point. And I had the same, getting tenure was like the best. It was on medications and anxiety and depression and insomnia, and getting tenure seemed to be miraculously improved my mental health.
Doctors should prescribe it. It's
yeah,
always
no,
patients in academia.
But yeah, I think two things. A lot of the stuff that Spitzer was writing at the time is just, from a philosopher's point of view, it's just a total mess. Because he wanted to give an operational definition of mental disorder itself, not just an operational definition of depression, but an operational definition of mental disorder. And so he was using all these, what he thought of it as these operational criteria. For example, it doesn't respond easily to educational reform. And he was thinking about, so this was part of the anti-psychiatry threat. He was thinking a lot about things like what supposedly was called sluggish schizophrenia back in the Soviet Union, when people who did not accept communism were given this label of sluggish schizophrenia. He was worried about things like that, and he wanted to argue that on his conception of what mental disorders are, that wouldn't count as a mental disorder because presumably if somebody didn't accept communism, you could get them to accept it, or you could at least get them to rethink their point of view just by sitting down and having a conversation with them, maybe educating them a little bit about the history of the Soviet Union. So that's the kind of thing that he was thinking of. Like he didn't anti-psychiatrists were worried that, well, what if Vietnam War protesters are called crazy because they don't accept the war. He said, look, that wouldn't count as a mental disorder because presumably that would respond to fairly simple, non-technical intervention, like just a philosophical conversation about the reasons we're in Vietnam. So that's what he had in mind, but I don't think philosophically it really hangs together well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both. These exchanges and all of these questions are just so substantive and wonderful. Dr. Cecilia Munn asked the following. Hi, Justin. Thank you for your presentation.
Hi.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the ethos of industrialization and quote unquote technological hubris as another contributing cause to the socio-historical establishment of psychiatry's authority.
Wow, that's a great question. It's hard to begin. I have a lot of things I want to say. So one thing, I'll just say this because there's so much you could possibly say. I mentioned this earlier. I said, sometimes people complain about anti-psychiatry, but what people call anti-psychiatry today is really, there's no parallel between what was called anti-psychiatry, not what was called anti-psychiatry, but the extent and the embeddedness and the popularity and the appeal of anti-psychiatry 50 years ago. I mean, it was such a part of culture. Movie like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest just gave voice to what everybody was thinking. Like, you guys, all you really do is manage social deviance, don't you? That movie was so popular because everybody kind of knew that that's what the psychiatrists were up to. And now I do think from the sociological point of view that the psychiatrist kind of won that argument. Like it's anti-psychiatry is an almost negligible part of the conversation today. The basic understanding or acceptance of psychiatry as having some authority over mental disorder, I think, is largely unquestioned. And so I think that does point to some profound sociological shift that's taken place over the last 50 years. And I don't claim to fully understand the nature of that shift, or I would like to know more about the nature of that shift. But yes, I think clearly part of it was the Prozac revolution. I mean, I was 16 when Prozac hit the market. I was very quickly put on Prozac, and I think so I definitely lived through that point of time where there was this idea that now psychiatry, because you go to your psychiatrist, you get a diagnosis, you get a prescription, we look so much like the rest of medicine. And I think that helped to kind of establish their authority. So again, I'm not saying they shouldn't have authority, but I think those technological changes, I think that's kind of what caused psychiatry to win the argument against the anti-psychiatrists.
Thank you so much. And I think that we, let's see, 1044, 1040. Yes. So Anna is the next question, which did get moved into the answered queue, but I have it here, so I'll read it out. They write, thank you for this great talk. As a very small point that might resonate with your argument/project on the point about pregnancy, I wonder whether you're familiar with the argument that the medicalization of pregnancy is often grounded in the idea that pregnant bodies are precisely violating the normal organism, which is in turn ontologically committed to the idea of the cis man's body as relatively stable, non-cyclical, etc. Iris Marion Young's pregnant embodiment is a helpful possible source.
sorry, with that last part, I didn't.
Oh,
I didn't
Iris
catch.
Marion Young's essay, Pregnant Embodiment, is a helpful possible source. So the question is, if you are familiar with the argument that pregnancy is precisely not normal, and then the reference is an offering to you in case you want to use it.
Yeah, I would love to see it. I haven't seen that. I would love to see that. I would love to see that. I'd be fascinated too to know how ideas about pregnancy as a medical condition have also changed in the last, I don't know, 50 years. I mean, I have no idea when it became just socially assumed that pregnancy requires a doctor, and how, I mean, the very general question that I'm interested in, so thank you for that, and I'll look it up, but the very general question that I'm interested in really isn't exclusive to mental illness. It's the question of what happens and how can history help to illuminate this? What happens when we come to see a certain kind of physical or psychological condition as being a medical issue, and how does that change it? So I wouldn't be surprised at all if, as it's become almost socially mandated that doctors should be around during pregnancy, that they have this central role in everything having to do with pregnancy, that some elements of medicalization have creeped in, or some elements of, I should say, pathologization should have creeped in. That's a fascinating connection. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Sophie, I'll just direct your attention separately in the chat to Owen R's comment to you. Ray Briggs asks of Justin, they write, I am persuaded that you're right about where psychiatrists think their authority comes from. Separately, I don't think it's adequate as a legitimate source of medical authority generally. It doesn't cover pregnancy prevention or trans medicine, both of which I would like doctors to help with. And there are harmless biological weirdnesses that I don't want doctors to have authority over. Do you think it is adequate? And if not, do you have any proposals for better alternatives? Just your non-difficult question.
Sorry, so if I understand right, the question is, I agree that we do want doctors to help with various things that we don't consider pathologies. And is the idea, like, what would be the philosophical basis for perhaps arguing that doctors should have authority over some of these things, even if we don't see them as pathological?
Yes. Ray, if you'd like to clarify, you're certainly welcome to. The way I read this question is inviting you to say more normatively about what you've set out descriptively.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I wish I had a really good answer to that, because I've definitely, struggled with anxiety, and I also inclined to think that anxiety is a pretty normal, even functional, designed, whatever, response to danger. So I don't really see it as pathological, yet at the same time, I have, and I completely respect. ADHD is the same thing. I tend to think of it as just ordinary cognitive variation, but at the same time, I respect and even see the need for doctors to regulate dispensing medicines that help people deal with it and get by in life, despite having something that's not a pathology. So I don't know. I respect that. That's a legitimate. That's something that it's good that doctors do. I'm glad that doctors are around to dispense medicine for things like anxiety and ADHD. I don't have any deep answer to that. I don't know like, how do you justify that philosophically? Maybe ultimately it would be really great if there was some other group of people that weren't doctors, or that, I don't know. I wish I could say more.
Thanks very much. Sorry, there's a trolley going by if you hear something in the background, Christmas trolley. We have just a moment further, but we can go over slightly because of the break that was taken earlier. So just to note that I don't want to put too much pressure on Justin, but we can do that. So maybe we'll turn to Joe and then Shelley to wrap up the conversation.
Great. Thanks so much. So I really appreciated the talk, and I don't know if I'm the only one around here, but having lived through the 1970s, it's quite interesting to see the difference now between, say, my school days and my son's school days. So in my primary school and secondary school, certainly in the UK, it may have been different elsewhere in the world, but there was no such thing as ADHD, no such thing as dyslexia, no such thing as dyspraxia. So we had the naughty child, the clumsy child, the child that didn't pay attention. And yeah, I can't say life was better for them for that. There was no diagnosis, but they were just treated as perhaps responsible for their behavior. At the same time, sort of ordinary motherhood was sort of pathologized. And so there were so many mothers on forms of anti-anxiety or antidepressive, the Mother's Little Helper song about it. But as far as I know, men were not getting that treatment just out of recollection. So you had this strange sort of pathologizing of motherhood and everyone else being left to look after themselves. So that so this is just a bit of commentary, anecdotal commentary. I don't know if this bears out just from sort of personal experience. At the same time as all of the very radical literature that you mentioned. So it's just a very strange moment. This is that dreaded thing, a comment, not a question, but I wondered if this is borne out in the research you've been doing. So thank you.
That's so interesting. I thank you for commentary. I don't know. I don't have much to say about it, except I mean, it makes sense. I think so much of the anti-psychiatry was based on an idea that I think people are returning to in some ways, because of course, the anti-psychiatry wasn't just psychiatrists are evil and they're just trying to reinforce the status quo, but a more specific positive proposal that a lot of the things that we consider mental health conditions are actually perfectly coherent, functional, meaningful, understandable responses to social problems. And it's really those social problems that need to be attacked. So I would think that, in a context where motherhood is getting pathologized, where it's like you just need Valium, just to survive the day-to-day of being a mother, I think that would absolutely set the stage for people like Lang and Saz saying, okay, wait a minute, some of these things that we're seeing, like severe depression, severe anxiety, some of the, hysteria, paralyzed limb, these are just forms of protest against what's clearly a terrible condition that we've put women in. So it seems like those two things hang together well.
Thank you. I'm keeping the remaining questions from the Q&A in a Word doc, Justin. I'll send that over to you as we end our session so they don't get lost.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And then Shelley, would you like to go ahead now?
Sure. Let me lower my hand. Well, first off, I wanted to point Justin to literature on midwifery, and I see that a couple of others in various places have done the same. For instance, there's well, I guess maybe you'd call it a pamphlet or a small piece of writing, a long essay by Barbara Ehrenreich, and I believe it's Deirdre English. On the history of midwifery and how how the very gendered takeover of pregnant, work around pregnancy by the male doctors. But I wanted to ask you two questions. Well, one, the answer will be very brief, I think. First off, I wanted to ask you if if what you're advancing you see as a functionalist evolutionary position. I'm picking up especially on your repeated use of the word design. And second of all, I wanted to ask you, you and Robert Chapman, engage in long discussions on Twitter, and I try to follow them, but I don't know, maybe you're having like discussions behind the scene too, because I find some of them hard to follow. So maybe if you could just for me and anyone else who tries to follow them, maybe if you could just sort of distinguish between or summarize your disagreements, like how would you characterize your position and Robert's and the distinction between them?
Boy, those are two really good questions. Yeah, first I mean, this is a separate project looking at the history of psychiatry and trying to figure out where psychiatry's authority comes from is really a separate project from my own kind of emerging view that a lot of the things that we consider to be mental health problems do have are functional, possibly in some evolutionary sense. So I tend to be more sympathetic to evolutionary psychiatry and evolutionary attempts looking at things like depression as functional responses. And I think not because I'm so obsessed with evolution or with Darwin, but I think it does, in the context of psychiatry, I actually think it has a kind of subversive quality to it. But I think evolutionary psychiatrists often will promote these hypotheses like, well, depression really isn't a pathology. It's a designed response to certain kinds of life problems or anxiety or BPD traits or ADHD. So I think it has this kind of, again, subversive and almost liberatory quality to it. But I know in one of the disagreements between Robert and I, and we do talk a lot kind of on Twitter and then behind the scenes. And I think one disagreement among many is that they think that evolutionary explanations are just tied to eugenics, tied to the reinforcement of a kind of strict distinction between the normal and the pathological that's ultimately going to be harmful for people with disabilities. So while I see this kind of subversive and liberatory angles, I think they see more of this. It's just bringing in evolution is bringing in a kind of objective minded distinction, mind-independent distinction between the normal and pathological, which is going to hurt people. It's better that if we saw this distinction as grounded in changing social values and this kind of social process of negotiation, that might be more healthy and beneficial. And I certainly respect that point of view. I don't agree with tarnishing evolutionary explanations with the history of eugenics and other things, but that's a deeper, more complex disagreement. I think more generally, I don't know how much Robert and I disagree, frankly. You know, sometimes I think that we disagree, but then we talk about it and then we realize that we're largely in agreement about stuff. I definitely, history-wise and personality-wise, tend to be way more skeptical about the role and power of psychiatry, as I suggested here. I think psychiatry does, appealing to psychiatry and appealing to the psychiatrist and diagnosis and medication. I think it's important, but I think it brings with it a lot of harms that we don't often see. And I think Robert is perhaps more, at least, ambivalent about the role of psychiatry. But thanks, interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. We're closing in on 10 additional minutes that we gave to this Q&A. So I just want to thank Justin and all the other participants in the conversation for engaging in that discussion. Again, I think that there are many fascinating things happening in the chat and discussion box. And so I will send those along to Justin by email and thank him again and thank Shelley and all the organizers of this conference. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melinda and Justin. Wonderful session, as evidenced by the incredible activity in the chat and the Q&A. I think we could have gone on for a long time, but we're not going to. We're going to stop now, and we'll be back on the half hour, whatever that is for you, with, I'm just checking the program. Jane Dryden will be presenting on gut issues and resources from disability theory. So that's in half an hour, and so have a great break. And hosts and presenters go to the backstage 5 minutes before that, so we can test out the equipment. So thanks very much.